Malcolm Matalka is the co-founder of Terrateam and is a trailblazer in the world of software engineering. Malcolm has deep expertise spanning bioinformatics, aerospace software, and infrastructure as code. Malcolm can be found coding around the world in his home office, which happens to be aboard an Amel Sharki Sailboat, where he brings adventure along with the journey. I can't say I'm not a little bit jealous. Enjoy. Malcolm, welcome to the show. How's it going?
Thanks for having me on. It's going pretty good. How about you?
Doing well. Doing well. So yeah, the work from anywhere movement is just plowing right ahead, and I heard you take that to the next level. Is it true that you were floating around the Caribbean recently on a sailboat?
The rumors are true. Earlier this year in March, I moved onto a 40-foot sailboat that I bought in the Caribbean. And for this year, I've been coming back and forth between Europe and the boat, most of the time on the boat, fixing it up, getting it ready to sail. And then, let's see, in September, I took the first proper passage on it, which was a great time.
So have you had sailing experience in the past, or was this just kind of an impulse, you know, thing to
It's
try?
uh So I thought I had sufficient experience before doing this. It was a bit of the actual decision to go forward with this was a bit of an impulse. But I did give myself a 3-year plan to execute on it, and I executed on time and on budget. And I took sailing classes in that time, but as I started sailing my boat, I realized I was not as prepared and experienced as I thought I was going in. The upside is it's it is hard to sail very well and efficiently, but it's not that hard to sail poorly and still not hit things.
That's good to know. That's good to so I gotta ask, like, what's a day in the life look like on a sailboat? Is you're a co-founder of Terra Team. You probably have a lot of things going on. What does a day in the life look like?
Yeah, I do have a lot of things going on, and at least in the beginning, a sailboat has a lot of work involved. At least mine did, because my sailboat's 40 years old, and it required some TLC before it could really do anything serious with it. Generally, I wake up between 5 and 6, and I do startup work for a while, work on Terrateam, and that might actually end up being the whole day, depending on what my plans are. Or I'll probably around lunchtime or so switch over to doing boat work because there's always projects that have to be done. I'm always fixing something or upgrading something, and do that for a while, and then going back and forth between that and the boat and the startup for the rest of the day. So I try to be pretty good about it with time management. I worked remotely for a long time actually before doing this. So I have pretty good self motivation, pretty good time management skills, pretty good tracking of what I'm doing skills. So it's really about just fitting all I can into a day. And the boat stuff, that stuff can always just wait another day if it has to.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like an adventure to me. And I mean, even regardless if you're on a boat or, I of course have a house full of some kids, and kids can break things faster than I think anything in the world. It's constant. So yeah, I know the whole feeling of at least, oh, got stuff to fix. The projects never end. But at least on a boat, the scenery's, um, much nicer,
Oh, it's
I
always
guess.
changing. Oh, I love it. I think for me, there's sort of a constant learning every day, at least for me, since I'm so new. It's something new to learn or a new thing I've read about that I want to try. Or, so for example, going into this, I knew nothing about diesel motors. And the motor on my boat had a lot of issues. It's 40 years old, it's the same as the boat, and it wasn't necessarily taken care of as best it could. So this year, I've just had to learn everything I can about that particular diesel motor and how they work in general. And it's been frustrating at times, of course, because sometimes you just want to be able to turn the motor on and go someplace. But it's also been really rewarding to fix something and then put it back together and turn it on and it goes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a skill that's not going to die out either. Like knowing anything mechanical like that is something you can take with you forever,
Yeah,
too.
definitely.
So,
And I've spent my entire life doing software work. So it's all in your head, you are when you're writing code, you're also evaluating it in your head and you're sort of compiling it and running it in your head, trying to think it's doing the right thing. You're going through all these scenarios, what it could do or couldn't do. And it's been really cool for me to actually be able to work with my hands. It's like a whole new world. Um, one of the things that I find funny is when you're doing software work, you're always kind of trying to look for the elegant solution for I've got this problem and what's the one that will disturb things the least or fits into the pattern I've got here. And when it comes to working with your hands, a lot of time it's like either push harder or grab a hammer.
there you go. Yeah, it's funny you say that because working in technology myself, I do two things to sort of either de-stress or just work with my hands. So I actually play semi-competitive ice hockey. But I got into woodworking because I was like at one point in my life, I was just working like all the time and I needed something to do. We had some stuff around the house that needed to get done and I started building and just never looked back. It's so peaceful. Like a lot of times I'm not even like listening to a podcast or anything. I've got my thoughts only and I'm just dialed in. I'm working with my hands and it's just a different experience and it helps me kind of de-stress to build, going from building something virtually to building something physically and seeing the fruits of your labor. It's very rewarding.
Yeah, 100%. I can completely relate. And I think it also has built confidence in that when I lived in a house, a lot of times I wouldn't want to do things because either it was expensive, I'd have to pay someone. And after this, I've sort of been like, well, I think I could probably figure out this, electrical situation myself. Or maybe for woodworking, you're like, well, I don't know, a table or a cabinet, or I want to fix this. I can probably just do it myself.
There you go. Yeah. So just kind of, I guess, to get onto the technical things.
Well,
Where did
this isn't a woodworking podcast.
No, as much as I'd like to do that one day, we'll see. Once I retire, maybe that would
Yeah,
be a
that
good.
that'd be good.
Yeah. So where did Terrateam come from? Where did the idea come from, and sort of how did it get started?
So Terrateam is a company that myself and my co-founder Josh started a few years ago. And we spent around a year or so working on getting playing with a few variations of the same idea. And what the product is a Terraform and OpenTofu GitOps/CI/CD that it's called the cool name is Tacos. If you're read those blog posts. So it's meant to help you collaborate with your team when doing infrastructure changes. And what makes us different, or the niche that we're really focused on, is very heavy GitHub integration. So when you use Terraform or OpenTofu, you want to do a plan to see what changes will be made to your infrastructure for the code that you've changed. And then once you've okayed that plan, you do an apply to make it happen. And for Terrateam, you stay entirely within GitHub for that operation. You see it, you create a pull request. We put the plan in your pull request. You can approve it just like you would any other pull request. And when you're ready, you do an apply, or we'll automatically do an apply once certain conditions are met. We also use your organization in GitHub as well. So if you have teams and roles set up, we will use that to make our back decisions. So we're very heavily integrated. The origin of all this was we both of us had the idea to start a company for a while and just sort of kicking around ideas. We've known each other for a really long time, and we've both been in the infrastructure space, well, tech space, of course, and then infrastructure as well. and we had used some of the other tools, and they just didn't really suit how we wanted to work with our infrastructure as code. We didn't like having to learn a new tool to go do something. We thought if it is code, it should have the same workflow as code. And when you run tests on your code in GitHub, it's not like you're running over to another program to see the outputs or anything. Everything just sort of comes to your pull request and you stay there. And then you make decisions there and you move on. And we wanted that flow.
Yeah, I love that flow just from the sheer fact of being able to um, control and guardrail things to a certain extent, while at the same time, like not really hampering development teams.
Yeah.
So maybe having, you build your conditions and your things into your pull requests. Maybe sometimes they get auto rejected. Other times there's more context needed, but you really have control in that pipeline, because I think the important thing is really like catching things before they make it out in the wild. Once they're out in the wild, it's really hard to wrangle things back in
Oh,
sometimes.
definitely.
So if you can get them in the build pipeline and you can get things right in the build pipeline, then yeah, it's
Yeah.
uh,
And it is sort of a tough line to straddle as a business, because you kind of lose a little brand recognition, because not that we don't want you to know you're using us, but we also just want you to be able to make the changes and not worry about it. So the flow should entirely be done within GitHub. We do have a UI where you can go and do other things that aren't part of your normal flow, but we don't want you to have to go there just so we can get clicks or something in analytics.
yeah. Well, that's what I honestly hear a lot of from DevOps cloud professionals, is they don't want to leave their whatever their CI/CD platform is, aka GitHub. Why do we need to leave and go do some other things on another tool and then come back and then revisit what we were doing? Why can't
Yeah,
our whole sort of change management process, if you will, be streamlined here?
it really kills your flow if you have to. And also just having to learn another tool can be it's just, it's another step in onboarding you have to do when you hire someone. It's another thing you have to remember. It's in it, and it's not necessary. That's the point. Like if there was a reason that you had to do it and it was necessary, but you don't.
Right, 100%. So it's 2023, almost 2024, and there's been a pretty strong and growing and sustained interest in um, uh, functional programming languages. And when I was chatting with your other co-founder Josh, he was saying that you all built Terrateam on OCaml. Any particular reason for that decision?
Oh yeah. So for those who don't know, OCaml is a functional programming language. You can sort of think of it, if you've heard of Haskell, which a lot of you have heard of, but it's the more practical version where Haskell is entirely pure. There's no variables that can be modified or anything like that. And in OCaml, they say they have sort of escape hatches where, well, if you really need mutability here, you can do it and it's okay. So I'd say it's more practical Haskell in that sense. To start with,
Uh,
I think so. There's a lot of debate out there about why I chose to use Rust or Python or Ruby or that. And it's, in my opinion, a lot of those blog posts are people back rationalizing why they chose the thing they enjoy using and trying to find technical reasons, because I think every language has a technical reason why it's probably a good fit for the problem you're solving. So for me, the truth is I enjoy writing OCaml. I feel very productive in it. When I wake up in the morning, I think it's a pleasant language to use. So, and I think that trumps probably most technical factors. So while I do think there are technical factors, bear in mind, I think whatever language you enjoy using is probably the one you're going to be more productive with, even if there are technical reasons for another one. So that being said, now that I've chosen to use OCaml, the type system is really a once you think about how to solve problems with a very powerful and expressive type system, it's sort of just how you look at everything. So in a language like Python, I feel like I have handcuffs on because I can't make decisions that the compiler checks for me. And then I just know that's always true anywhere in the code. I don't have to go and assert that this is a string or an init or write unit tests for those sort of things. So we do a lot of stuff in our code, which, as we're a small company, means we have to do less in terms of testing. Code review can be easier because we encode certain things into the code, the types, and the compiler does that heavy work for us. For example, we have, before we run a Terraform operation, we want to make sure that the values that we've evaluated have gone through a security check. For example, that user is capable of doing that operation. They're capable of doing that operation on the specific directories that we want to do it on. So we encode that in the type system where the code that runs the operation needs to take a type that has the flag on it that says it's gone through security checks. So that way, if we add a new feature or we refactor the code, the compiler will tell us if, hey, you created a path here where you missed the security checkpoint, so you can't actually make this call here. You have to go through that. And that's a nice feature where we just have this guarantee everywhere that no matter how the code evolves over time, that won't be lost.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember like back, it's been a little while, but I was exploring different new hip things, and I was like messing around with Rust, and I think that's the first time I actually looked at OCaml a little more in depth. Um, and I'm just curious about your thoughts on the ecosystem, like including the libraries, frameworks, even like maybe community support, things like that. How easy is it to find examples and resources and help if you need it?
The OCaml community is pretty anemic relative to other more popular languages such as Rust or Python. But one reason that I personally feel very productive in OCaml is because I feel like I can solve pretty much any problem we hit pretty easily if there isn't a library that does it for us. We also, so we like we use OCaml, but another sort of strange decision we've made is we don't really use external frameworks. So we kind of have a rule of thumb that's no to frameworks, but yes to libraries. We do have internal frameworks that we manage. And the reason for that is because we want to have control over these things that are so fundamental to how the application runs. And frameworks take control of the flow of your application. And it it's a result that sort of comes from my experience using things like Django, where I found it very difficult to debug certain Django issues because there's so much magic going on to go from what you've specified to how it actually shows up in the browser. And I found that very frustrating. And I thought, well, I know I don't have actual metrics for you, but my belief was that yes, Django got me going kind of quickly, but I lost a lot of that in trying to figure out how all this magic worked when I ran into something that was unexpected. And
Gotcha.
yeah, so by having our own frameworks, we know how every little part of that works. Now, libraries are different because libraries, you generally call something and you get a result, and it's not controlling the flow of your program. So those are pretty safe to incorporate in our world. Now, that's not true for everything. We do use a framework for some web service functionality, things like our Prometheus integration that we use to track how the backend is doing and all that. But for the most part, we try to keep those as high level rules of thumb.
So to basically summarize, you chose OCaml, first of all, because you're really familiar with it. And, the more familiar you are with a language, of course, you're going to be more productive with it. You're going to understand it better.
Yeah,
You're going to
and
be
I
able to
like it.
make it do more. Yeah. And other than that, happens to be, it's a functional programming language. It fits the bill for this type of product anyhow. So,
Hmm.
it's the right solution to solve the problem. Any challenges that stand out in your head? Like I'm a founder and I'm going to go start, a project with OCaml today. Is there anything you'd tell me? that I might want to get out in front of?
Yeah, I would say try it a little bit first. Like I said, I think choosing technologies that you enjoy using is number one because you're going to be motivated to solve problems in those technologies. You're going to get up and be able to. A lot of, to be fair, a lot of product work is kind of boring. And if you're using technologies you enjoy, you can push through that to get back to the exciting stuff. Like a lot of it is finding, how wide should this button be on a UI, and that's not a ton of fun. So I would say try it out. Definitely. So there's a package manager called OPAM, which is where all the libraries and frameworks go. Check that out. Think about what integrations you might need and see if they exist there and what your options are. If you're making a product that is very integration heavy, it might not be the right choice because there might not be those integrations that you need. If you're making a product where you're getting a lot of values from the user and you just have to process them in whatever way you do and then give out a result, it may be perfectly fine for that.
All right. Yeah, that's great advice. Um, and so like moving on, I guess a little bit. Open source is continuing to make headlines. I feel like I read something every day. I think it's at a. I think there's a maybe a broad shift. Things are changing a little bit. It's kind of interesting, and it's who knows where the future is going to go. But how would you define open source for yourself, and why is it such a crucial aspect of any modern day software development?
I forget where I heard this definition of open source, but I really like it. And it is open source is the gift of now it's your problem. And the idea being you've open sourced it, use it. If you have an issue, you can solve it or you cannot solve it, but you don't, the maintainer's not required to do anything for you. And that I think is the core. You can do it forever you want, but you're not entitled to anything after that. And then there's layers above that, of course, where people have open source where they treat it more like a product and they respond quickly to people's requests. And so you can go, but at its core, I think it's really at that. Um, and I think it's unfortunate that a lot of the news that we're seeing these days is actually about companies who built themselves on open source kind of turning their back on it.
Yeah, that seems to be the skinny of it, really.
Yeah.
There's definitely a trend. Open source projects are getting started, and they're built purely with that passion, with that joy of building the software and solving a problem, and then the community gets involved. These projects get more valuable. They get more widely adopted, and poof,
Yep.
some big company, maybe they IPO, and then they need to have some sort of like quarter over quarter growth because they're beholden to shareholders and such. So they change the original licensing to STEMI competition.
Yeah.
Um,
Sort of the,
I
the
think,
elephant in the room in here is on August 10th, HashiCorp changed the license of several of their products to a Bucel license, which by Bucel's own definition is not an open source license. It's called a source available license. So you can see the source, but you can't do whatever you want with it like a traditional open source license. And that impacted myself and a number of other HashiCorp competitors.
yeah, yeah. And I don't, so originally I was like, oh, this is probably so bad. And, it's, your initial like knee jerk reaction, I guess. But the more that I've thought about it and the more that I've settled on it, the maybe it's a good thing for innovation. So you have different options now. Um, you have Open Tofu and you have Terraform, and you know, I don't think it can hurt by having a project that's adopted by the Linux Foundation that has the right community involvement, that's actually working on that maybe going a different direction, and they're not again beholden to like the things that a normal like a publicly traded company would be um beholden to. So I think maybe it's going to pan out to be a good thing
Yeah, it
long term.
might. I so I can't speak to the other products that were impacted by this. Um, I do think Terraform is different in that it is such a community project. Yes, HashiCorp wrote Terraform the CLI and they manage a number of providers, but there's so many other providers that are offered by other companies or just users that are passionate about it. And that is actually what makes Terraform useful to use. The CLI is nothing without those providers and that community behind it. And in that sense, I think it's closer to like your Rust compiler or your C compiler, where you're taking HCL, which is your Terraform code, and turning it and compiling it into infrastructure. And I don't think anyone wants to live in a world where they have to pay for their compilers again. Like we went through that in the 90s, and then open source compilers came along. People were like, yeah, this is clearly the better solution.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that so I'm typically tend to be glass half full, even if it's a bad situation. It's how I survive in this life. But one thing that was pretty kind of sad to see, and I think the big thing that tends to happen, and this is kind of a reoccurring thing, is it splits the community pretty bad. And I noticed a lot of, I don't know what the word would be, like maybe like influencers or folks that have been involved with Terraform from like the beginning that are kind of like public figures and advocates. Um, but also, those folks worked with some of these other startups that were impacted by the licensing change. So it really put a lot of those folks in a a really tough position,
Yeah.
because some of them had made their bread and butter, their branding, all their things were built by contributing and giving to the community on the Terraform side. But then this happens, and it's really like, it's almost like, it reminds me of like being a kid and just maybe having your parents ask, which one of us do you like better, or you've got to choose one of us, and I hate seeing that. It,
Yeah, I think that's a real shame too. And so there's a meme of, this doesn't impact 99% of Terraform users. And I personally disagree with that because, maybe in the short term it doesn't, in this months to a year, something like that. But if there isn't an alternative such as OpenTofu that's viable, it effectively means the only way to monetize your contribution to Terraform can be done by HashiCorp. So take someone like Gruntwork with TerraGrunt. So they make this tool that has increased the size of Terraform users considerably. They have contributed so much to Terraform. And one obvious way that for them to monetize their open source tool called TerraGrunt would be to offer an integrated CI/CD experience, because they understand all that code best. They could integrate it the best. They give a really good experience to their users. And with the licensing change, HashiCorp has said, no, you can't do that unless we say it's okay. And so apply that to all the people working on Terraform related projects. A great way to monetize it is to give people an experience that is best suited for that project. And that's been taken away. So go ahead 5 years, and there's not a strong incentive to actually build those tools for Terraform, I think.
yeah, I totally agree. This kind of brings me to another point where, do you think it's even possible for like vendor owned open source projects to successfully maintain some sort of balance between their, they have commercial interests they have to contend with, they have to make money, and also the open source community that helped get them to where they were at? Like, is it possible for a vendor to sort of own this and see it through?
I think that if you're going to open source something as a business, you really, 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 really need to think hard about it, because it's kind of a one-way street. Even with the Terraform changes, the code is still available. Yes, it's not open source, but imagine them trying to remove that code completely. There'd be like a riot. So you really have to consider what you're doing when you're gonna open source any part of your organization, and what you're going to do in the long run if it doesn't work out like you're hoping. I think that it would have been great for Terraform to become part of the Linux Foundation, HashiCorp to say, we have Terraform Cloud, which is our commercial offering that provides these features on top of Terraform. But the actual Terraform CLI itself, we think that is just a public good at this point. We should give that away. That's probably really hard to do. And probably the only way it'll really happen at this point is if OpenTofu is very successful, which I hope it is. But internally, we're actually considering open sourcing parts of our product. And we're going through a lot of discussion on, are we doing this for the right reasons? It's not, as they say, open source isn't a business strategy, but is it a good business decision? Is it going to harm the business, help the business? Not matter. And we are just thinking really hard because we don't want to open source something, realize that it's actually harming the business. And, we still need to eat like anyone else, and be in a real pickle for what we're going to do about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a few good points. So if you did say that Malcolm made the decision to open source Terrateam today, what license would you use out of curiosity?
We've talked about that as well. I think, and nothing's written in stone, so don't send me hate mail or anything, but I think we would try to use a license where if you do take Terrateam, you can build a product out of it, but any changes you make to Terrateam have to be open source. So you can't turn it into so not as permissive as like an MIT license or something like that.
I guess somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like you sort of mentioned, the age-old problem of open source is how can you build a thing and how can you monetize it in a way that doesn't lose that original fire, the original spirit and value of open source to begin with. How what is the right way to approach this if you're considering open sourcing a project, or how do you even think about that?
Well, I guess time will tell if we're thinking about this the right way. But how we've been approaching it is things you open source are tools and things you monetize are products. The core question is, what's that mean exactly? But the rough idea is the portions of Terrateam, because we don't want to open source the whole thing, but the portions we would open source would be something you could use as a command line to accomplish some piece of work that we do, some subset of the work. And it wouldn't have necessarily the same support model that we have for our product. We may or may not accept contributions. Again, we don't know. We have to think about exactly what we want to do. But it would definitely not be, I think, how you would just consider something a product where it has all these integrations with other things and it's meant to have this great installation UX, and we are fielding support in the same way. So I think there has to, so you have to find some demarcation point where it's like, this makes sense, because we also don't want to release like a version, whatever we do open source, we don't want to feel artificially limited. Like, oh, it has these things that could clearly be part of it still, but they're missing. A good example is the way we've been thinking about it is the portion of our code base which actually runs the work that the backend has decided to run. And that involves interpreting the rconfig file and actually running Terraform and storing results and doing these things would make a lot of sense as the open source portion, because you can just modify where it consumes what work to actually do. So we could have another way to decide, well, I'll run it on these directories and do a plan, and then it would come up with that work. However, we have various security features, such as access control, validating that you're going against a valid destination branch, and making sure that all of your status checks have passed before we actually do an apply. Those sort of things really make sense as a backend, because we need this third-party witness to all these things are correct. Because if you have them as part of the things people run on their CI/CD, they could just modify it to ignore those. So the things that are more security related, we think make more sense as a backend. And we think that's a good demarcation point. So you can run the work you've decided to run, but the thing that does the extra checks for deciding what work to run would probably stay proprietary.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Usually there's some sort of like core product offering that does a really good thing, and then if you want to take it further, the opportunity's there for you to DIY it,
Yeah.
potentially. But at the same time, a lot of companies have limited staffing, and a lot of times they're willing to pay for those extra features, as long as the product is solving their problem. So it
Yeah,
sounds like a good approach to me.
that's how we're thinking about it. Again, we haven't committed to open sourcing these portions, but we're definitely heading in that direction. And that's just sort of, and I think it's actually a really interesting exercise as a company to sit down and think about, all right, well, if we were to open source any of the tooling that we've made, what would it be and why? And do we think that would be good, bad, or in doesn't matter for our bottom line? Do we think it would be a good business decision or no? And do we think it'd be good for the community? Because like one really compelling reason that we want to open source this is we actually think there are not very many good open source solutions for doing um, Terraform CI/CD out there. So the main one is called Atlantis, and it definitely has its strengths, but it also has its weaknesses. And we think that our customers tell us that many of them used Atlantis before and came to us, and they like what we did and how we did it a lot better. And we think, all right, well, like for this subset of feature, it's probably just good for the community for them to have access to this thing that many people tell us is actually really good.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And um, I guess kind of thinking of it too from the if if you do open source something, you get a lot of feedback whether you want it or not. If people are going to use it, they're going to test it. You're going to get a lot of stuff coming in. Oh, can you do this, and this? So it creates a lot of work for the maintainers, and that they have to almost become like your product owners
Yep.
essentially, and have some way of vetting and validating updates and what goes in and to the roadmap or not. So you sort of open up the floodgates there in a
Yeah.
sense. But
I do think
yeah,
this is one advantage we kind of have in that regard is we're not starting open source. We're sort of deciding to go open source. And so the piece that we would be open sourcing is really battle tested for the most part. Now, I'm sure people are going to be able to find bugs in it, especially because we'll have to do a little bit of work on it to get it in a state where it's really usable open source. But the core of it has really gone through the paces. So hopefully it's relatively bug free.
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So even speaking of going back to the Open Tofu Terraform thing, I saw on the Open Tofu blog. So I don't know when this is going to get released, but right now it's December 20th, and I think the blog went out yesterday.
Yep.
Um, it seems like there's a lot of good progress. They put out a release candidate, and they're saying general availability is slated for January 19th.
Yep. Yep.
So a lot of good progress is being made. What's your impression of how things are going with Open Tofu so far?
I think it's going really good. The uh, back when OpenTofu was made, there was a lot of companies committing full-time engineers or salary for full-time engineers to OpenTofu. And I think at the beginning, people were sort of like, yeah, that's easy to write down. But those commitments are actually coming through. There are people being hired to work full-time on OpenTofu. I think that's great. It's been probably around 3 months since it was first forked. And then, so I guess it'll be close to 4 months once it's finally released. And that may seem like a long time, but initially forking Terraform is actually a much larger project than a lot of people, I think, realize. One of the biggest things is in order to be usable, really, you need a provider registry. And the Terraform one has a little part of the license that says only the Terraform CLI is allowed to call the HashiCorp registry. So all the infrastructure for managing the registry, getting things in there automatically, handling versions, all that had to be done from scratch. And so that has been, I think, probably one of the larger lead times on it, as well as testing, getting all the feature set into this release of OpenTofu. So I think it's probably going to go more feature rich quickly once it's finally released, once the first stable release comes out. So I think it's pretty exciting. And also being part of Linux Foundation means that there's a guarantee of being open source for its entire lifetime, which is a guarantee of stability for if you choose to use OpenTofu. You don't have to worry that if quarterly results aren't being hit, that the license might change again to try to extract more money out of you.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, I noticed the website got updated not too long ago for
Yep.
OpenTofu. It looks really clean, really polished. It's beginning to come together. And my thoughts were, with all the updates, I follow a lot of the folks, like on LinkedIn and such, and it seems like progress is just, those fires are lit and the wheels are turning fast.
Oh yeah.
I think, a year from now, it's who knows, but yeah, that you're right about the provider registry, the modules, the policies. Those are what makes Terraform so great. So
Yeah, it's the
of
community.
course, that has to be matured and fleshed out for OpenTofu as well.
Yep. And the dev channel for OpenTofu just has pull requests going through it all day. So there is active work, lots of it going on. I think there is a bit of an uphill battle still for OpenTofu because I think one of the power asymmetries in open source is the company that open sources the product. Even though it's open source, you can do whatever you want with it. Most people want to support that company, and they want to go back to that company because they're the actual originators of that product. And I think that's good because we should support companies that are doing this. So there is this advantage of, well, it's Terraform, and people ask, like, OpenTofu will always be, at least for the foreseeable future, defined in terms of Terraform, right? So it's always going to be the thing that was a fork of Terraform, and it'll probably never be just its own thing unless Terraform gets merged back into OpenTofu. So it is an uphill battle for people who hear about Terraform to end up coming to OpenTofu. We hope with it being part of the Linux Foundation and being very community centric, because that was one of the complaints, was that many people felt that HashiCorp was not being a good steward of Terraform, not accepting pull requests, not reviewing pull requests, sort of rejecting things that maybe conflicted with what they wanted to do internally. And OpenTofu does not have that problem. Yes, it was created by a bunch of competitors, but we're also multiple vendors who are competing, and we've given it to Linux Foundation. And so our ability to control it is, first of all, not singular because no single vendor controls it, but also the Linux Foundation provides a governance model that includes the community and lets anyone really contribute to it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And yeah, as far as the uphill battle, it's always, at least with I came from the enterprise space originally, so I've worked for a few big companies, and usually the thing that ends up happening is they're going to choose, like, okay, who's the biggest company that has maybe the most revenue, that's like the lead, or that's on a Gartner Magic Quadrant, or like there's these check boxes that they want checked, and it's like, okay, we'll use that product, and then we'll start talking about functionality and features and such. So there's that stigma, I think, which is slowly changing. I think over the years I've seen that change, where at least the last big company I worked for, we did some R&D type stuff, and we started looking at products like startups and such, because the big box companies didn't have solutions for particular problems we were trying to solve.
Mm-hmm.
So what can you do then? You can either bang their door down and try and get something on a roadmap, which could take years, or go to a startup that's doing that thing, and there might be a little bit of risk involved as far as what an enterprise perceives as risk. But yeah, if you don't take those steps, what are the risks?
Yeah.
Possibly losing out on additional market share and growing your platforms and your sustainability and your operations and such.
Oh, yeah. And I think, like you said, you do have to consider the risk, but at the same time, even a smaller company can have an outsized impact on the roadmap of another startup. So you're not going to be able to tell IBM what to do over the next 6 months. But for like a company like us, we respond very well to customers saying, hey, this feature is important to us and we think it would work great in your product. And that really, it goes into our backlog, and a lot of times it gets prioritized because if a customer wants it, that's why they're here, to have the product that's doing what they want.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're coming to the end of the segment, I guess. Do you want to? I just want to open up the floor to you. Is there anything you'd like to tell the audience? Anything that stands out? Um, just top of mind.
Well, you can find Terrateam at terrateam.io. I assume there'll be links in the description. Also join our Slack. We have a little community growing of people that can help others get set up and going with Terrateam. And then we are there and we respond very quickly to questions. And if you're a company that wants to have an outsized impact on the direction of a product of another company, then we might be the company for you.
Awesome. And I'll put your. I found a YouTube, the boring
Yep,
sailing YouTube, which
that's
is pretty
me.
cool. Yeah, I'll throw that in the link description as well, along with your LinkedIn and the Slack link,
Yeah. Oh,
so people
thanks.
can find you. All
Thank you
right.
very
Well, thank
much.
you for coming on. I appreciate the time.
Oh, thanks. This was a lot of fun.